England in the 16th century was a nation at a crossroads, threatened by powerful enemies and torn apart by religious conflict. And yet, one woman rose to the throne and steered her country to greatness. Elizabeth I, famously known as the Virgin Queen, ruled over what would come to be known as the Elizabethan Era. How did she manage to lead with such success, especially in a time when few believed a woman could? Whose reign shaped the course of an entire era, marked what we now call the Elizabethan Era. But what made her reign so special? Early life. Elizabeth was born at Greenwich Palace on September 7, 1533. And was named after her grandmothers, Elizabeth of York and Lady Elizabeth Howard. She was the second child of Henry VIII of England to be born while his marriage to Anne Boleyn was still valid. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was Henry's second wife. Right from the start, Elizabeth was seen as the next in line to the English throne. Her older half-sister, Mary, had lost her claim to the throne when Henry ended his marriage to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, to marry Anne, with the goal of having a son to secure the Tudor line. Elizabeth was baptized on September 10, 1533, with Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry Courtenay, Marquess of Exeter, Elizabeth Stafford, Duchess of Norfolk, and Margaret Wotton, Dowager Marchioness of Dorset, serving as her godparents. At her baptism, a canopy was placed over her by her uncle George Bullen, Viscount Rochford, John Hussey, Baron Hussey of Sleaford, Lord Thomas Howard, and William Howard, Baron Howard of Effingham. At just 2 years and 8 months old, Elizabeth's mother was executed on May 19, 1536, just 4 months after Catherine of Aragon's passing. Following her mother's death, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and stripped of her claim to the throne. However, she was then placed in the care of her half-brother, who carried out her christening. Her first governess, Margaret Bryan, noted that Elizabeth was as tender and gentle as I have ever known any child to be. Catherine Champernon, who later became known as Catherine "Cat" Ashley, took over as Elizabeth's governess in 1537 and remained her close friend until her death in 1565. Champernon taught Elizabeth 4 languages: French, Dutch, Italian, and Spanish. By the time William Grindal became her tutor in 1544, Elizabeth could write in English, Latin, and Italian. Grindal was a skilled and talented tutor who also helped Elizabeth advance in French and Greek. By the age of 12, she managed to translate her stepmother Catherine Parr's religious work, Prayers or Meditations, from English into Italian, Latin, and French, which she presented to her father as a gift for the new year. Throughout her teenage years and life, Elizabeth translated works in Latin and Greek by various classical authors, including Cicero's Pro Marcello, Boethius, De Consolation Philosophiae, a treatise by Plutarch, and Tacitus' Annals of Tacitus. A translation of Tacitus from the Lambeth Palace Library, one of the few surviving English translations from the early modern period, was confirmed as Elizabeth's own in 2019. Following a detailed analysis of the handwriting and paper. Following Grindal's passing in 1548, Elizabeth continued her education under the guidance of her brother Edward's mentor, Roger Ascham. Ascham was a compassionate educator who held the belief that education should be both engaging and effective. Much of what we know about Elizabeth's education and her early intelligence is derived from Ascham's writings. By the conclusion of her formal education in 1550, Elizabeth had emerged as one of the most well-educated women of her time. It was believed that she could speak the Welsh, Cornish, Scottish, and Irish languages, in addition to the ones previously mentioned. The Venetian ambassador in 1603 noted that she was so fluent in these languages that they seemed to be her native ones. Historian Mark Stoyle theorizes that she might have learned Cornish from William Killigrew, who served as the groom of the Privy Chamber and later became the Chamberlain of the Exchequer. Thomas Seymour. In 1547, Henry VIII passed away, and his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, ascended to the throne. Shortly after, Catherine Parr, Henry's late wife, wed Thomas Seymour, the uncle of Edward VI and the brother of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who became the Lord Protector. They brought Elizabeth into their home at Chelsea, where she faced a period of emotional turmoil that some experts believe impacted her for the rest of her life. Thomas Seymour indulged in playful activities with Elizabeth, including sneaking into her room in his nightgown, tickling her, and playfully slapping her buttocks. Elizabeth, in response, woke up early to avoid his unwanted morning visits. Instead of confronting her husband about his inappropriate behavior, Parr participated in it. On 2 occasions, she joined Seymour in tickling Elizabeth, and once, she held her while he destroyed her black gown. However, upon discovering the couple in a loving embrace, Parr put an end to their relationship. In May 1548, Elizabeth was sent away. Despite this, Thomas Seymour continued plotting to gain control over the royal family and attempted to secure the position of the king's personal guardian. He also sought to marry Elizabeth after Parr's death, with her governess, Kat Ashley, who was sympathetic towards Seymour, trying to persuade Elizabeth to choose him as her husband. She encouraged Elizabeth to write Seymour, offering comfort in her sorrow. But Elizabeth refused, stating that Thomas was not deeply affected by her stepmother's death, thus not in need of comfort. In January 1549, Seymour was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower on charges of plotting to overthrow his brother, Somerset, as the Lord Protector, to marry Lady Jane Grey to King Edward VI, and to marry Elizabeth. Elizabeth, residing at Hatfield House, remained silent. Her defiance frustrated her interrogator, Robert Tyrwhitt, who noted, "I see it in her eyes that she is guilty." Seymour was executed by beheading on March 20, 1549. Reign of Mary I. Edward VI passed away on July 6, 1553, at the tender age of 15. His will overlooked the 1543 succession to the Crown Act, excluding both Mary and Elizabeth from the line of succession, and instead named Lady Jane Grey, the granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary Tudor, as his heir. Jane was crowned queen by the Privy Council, but her support quickly collapsed, leading to her removal from the throne after just 9 days. On August 3, 1553, Mary entered London triumphantly, accompanied by Elizabeth. However, their unity did not endure. Mary, a devout Catholic, aimed to eradicate Protestantism, which Elizabeth had been raised in, and she mandated that all attend Catholic Mass. Elizabeth was forced to publicly adhere. Mary's initial popularity waned in 1554 following her announcement of her engagement to Philip of Spain, the son of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a staunch Catholic. Dissatisfaction spread swiftly across the nation, with many turning to Elizabeth as a leader against Mary's religious policies. In January and February 1554, Wyatt's rebellion erupted and was swiftly quelled. Elizabeth was brought before the court to be questioned about her involvement, and on March 18, she was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Elizabeth vehemently denied any wrongdoing. Although it was unlikely she had conspired with the rebels, some of them had approached her. Mary's most loyal advisor, Emperor Charles's ambassador Simon Renard, argued that her reign would be perpetually threatened by Elizabeth's presence. And Lord Chancellor Stephen Gardiner advocated for Elizabeth's trial. Elizabeth's allies in the government, including William Paget, Baron Paget, persuaded Mary to spare her sister in the face of insufficient evidence. Instead, on May 22, Elizabeth was transferred from the Tower to Woodstock, where she spent nearly a year confined to her home under the supervision of Henry Bedingfeld. The public celebrated her every move. On April 17, 1555, Elizabeth was summoned back to court to witness the final stages of Mary's supposed pregnancy. If Mary and her child died, Elizabeth would ascend to the throne. However, if Mary gave birth to a healthy child, Elizabeth's prospects of becoming queen would diminish significantly. When it became evident that Mary was not pregnant, disbelief spread that she could conceive. Elizabeth's path to the throne seemed secure. Upon taking the Spanish crown in 1556, King Philip recognized the changing political landscape and nurtured his sister-in-law. She proved to be a more reliable partner than the primary contender, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had spent her youth in France and was engaged to the Dauphin of France. When his wife became sick in 1558, Philip dispatched the Count of Feria to seek advice from Elizabeth. This meeting took place at Hatfield House, where Elizabeth had returned to reside in October 1555. By October 1558, Elizabeth was already formulating her plans for governing. Mary acknowledged Elizabeth as her successor on November 6, 1558, and Elizabeth ascended to the throne upon Mary's death on November 17. Accession. Elizabeth became queen at the age of 25. When she took the throne, she addressed her council and peers who had come to Hatfield to pledge their loyalty. In her speech, Elizabeth introduced the idea of the sovereign's two bodies, the natural body and the political body. She said, "My lords, the law of nature compels me to grieve for my sister's passing. The responsibility that now rests on me is overwhelming, yet I know that, as God's servant, I must accept it. I sincerely hope for His grace to help me carry out His will in this role I have been given. Though I am but one person naturally, I am, by His will, a ruler entrusted with governance. I ask all of you to assist me so that together, we may serve well and make a lasting positive impact on the world. I will govern with thoughtful advice and counsel." As she made her way through the city before her coronation, Elizabeth was warmly welcomed by the people. They greeted her with speeches and festive displays, many of which had a strong Protestant message. Elizabeth's friendly and gracious manner won the hearts of the spectators, who were deeply impressed. On January 15, 1559, chosen based on advice from her astrologer John Dee, Elizabeth was crowned in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was conducted by Owen Oglethorpe, the Catholic Bishop of Carlisle. The day was filled with the sounds of organs, fifes, trumpets, drums, and bells as Elizabeth was presented to the people for their approval. Although she was celebrated as the new queen, England was still anxious about the Catholic threat both at home and abroad. And there was much speculation about her future marriage. Church settlement. Elizabeth's personal religious beliefs have been a topic of much discussion among historians. Although she was Protestant, she kept some Catholic symbols, like the crucifix, and did not emphasize sermons as much as other Protestants would expect. Elizabeth and her advisors were concerned about a possible Catholic attack on England. To address this, Elizabeth aimed to create a religious settlement that satisfied Protestants without upsetting Catholics too much. However, she was not willing to support the Puritans, who wanted more extensive changes. Consequently, the Parliament of 1559 began working on a church structure based on the Protestant reforms of Edward VI, with the Queen as its leader. This new church included many Catholic traditions, such as specific vestments. The House of Commons strongly supported the new proposals. But the bill faced resistance in the House of Lords, particularly from the bishops. Elizabeth was lucky that many bishop positions, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, were vacant at that time. This allowed her supporters to outvote the bishops and conservative peers. However, Elizabeth had to accept the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England instead of the more controversial title of Supreme Head, which some believed was inappropriate for a woman. The Act of Supremacy was enacted on May 8, 1559. It required all public officials to swear an oath of loyalty to the Queen as Supreme Governor, or they would be disqualified from their positions. The harsh heresy laws from Mary's reign were repealed to prevent the persecution of dissenters. At the same time, the Act of Uniformity was passed, making it compulsory to attend church and use the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, which was a modified version of the 1552 Prayer Book. However, the penalties for not attending or conforming were not severe. Marriage question. From the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, there was much anticipation about whom she would marry. Despite receiving numerous marriage proposals, Elizabeth never wed and remained without children. The reasons behind her decision are not entirely clear. Some historians suggest that her earlier experience with Thomas Seymour may have influenced her reluctance towards relationships. Throughout her life, Elizabeth considered several potential suitors, with her last notable courtship being with Francis, Duke of Anjou, who was 22 years younger than her. While marrying could have provided the advantage of an heir, Elizabeth was wary of the potential risks. Marrying could lead to the loss of power, similar to her sister Mary I's situation with King Philip II of Spain. and might also create political instability or even unrest. In the spring of 1559, it became clear that Elizabeth had strong feelings for her childhood friend, Robert Dudley. It was rumored that Dudley's wife, Amy, was suffering from a serious illness. And there was speculation that Elizabeth would consider marrying him if his wife passed away. By the fall of that year, foreign suitors were competing for Elizabeth's hand. And their representatives were discussing the scandalous rumors about her relationship with Dudley. Many in England were not supportive of a possible marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley, with some saying that no man would accept this union. When Amy Dudley died in September 1560 after falling down a flight of stairs, many suspected foul play. Although the coroner's inquest declared her death accidental, rumors spread that Dudley had orchestrated her death to clear the way for a royal marriage. For a time, Elizabeth seriously considered marrying Dudley. However, key advisors like William Cecil and some conservative nobles made it clear that they disapproved of the idea. There were even whispers that the nobility might rebel if the marriage went ahead. Dudley remained a favored figure in Elizabeth's life for nearly another decade, and she even made him the Earl of Leicester in 1564. Despite their closeness, Elizabeth never married him. And when he eventually married Lettice Knowles in 1578, Elizabeth reacted with fury and lifelong bitterness. Dudley remained at the center of Elizabeth's affections, and after his death in 1588, she kept his final letter among her most treasured belongings. Throughout Elizabeth's reign, her possible marriage was a key aspect of foreign policy. Early on, she turned down a proposal from Philip II of Spain, her half-sister's widower. But she did entertain the idea of marrying King Eric XIV of Sweden for several years. Other potential suitors included various European nobles, including Charles II, Archduke of Austria, and Henry, Duke of Anjou. Her last serious courtship was with Francis, Duke of Anjou, a French prince 22 years her junior. Elizabeth wore a frog-shaped earring he gave her, showing she may have taken this proposal to heart for a time. However, as always, she chose not to marry, knowing that any match could lead to political unrest or a loss of power. In 1563, Elizabeth told a foreign diplomat that if it were up to her, she would prefer to remain a single beggar woman than a married queen. The question of her marriage and succession became even more pressing after she fell ill with smallpox later that year. Parliament began urging her to either marry or name an heir to prevent a civil war in the event of her death. Elizabeth refused to do either, standing firm in her belief that the issue should remain unresolved. In April of that year, she dissolved Parliament and would not allow it to reconvene until 1566, when she needed its approval for taxes. Though she had previously given assurances that she would marry, Elizabeth later told Parliament that she would only marry if God did not take away the man she intended to wed or if other major obstacles didn't arise. By 1570, most of her government had privately accepted that Elizabeth would neither marry nor name a successor. William Cecil, her trusted advisor, began planning for the succession behind the scenes. Some accused Elizabeth of irresponsibility for not securing an heir, but she understood that naming a successor would weaken her own position. Elizabeth had lived as a second person during Mary I's reign and knew how such figures could be used in plots against the current monarch. Virginity. Elizabeth's decision to remain unmarried gave rise to a powerful image of her as a virgin queen, often compared to the Virgin Mary. In poems and portraits, she was portrayed not as an ordinary woman, but as a goddess or a symbol of purity. Initially, Elizabeth herself emphasized her virginity, telling Parliament in 1559 that it would be enough for her legacy if a marble stone declared that the Queen, having reigned for such a time, lived and died a virgin. Over time, this idea was further developed by poets and writers, who celebrated her as a symbol of virtue. By 1578, public references to Elizabeth's virginity were also a subtle way to oppose her potential marriage to the Duke of Alençon. Elizabeth ultimately declared that she was married to her kingdom and people, stating in 1599 that her true husbands were her loyal subjects. Not everyone accepted the claim of Elizabeth's virginity. Some critics, especially Catholics, accused her of immoral behavior, suggesting that her actions tarnished both her reputation and that of her country. Henry IV of France even remarked that one of the great mysteries of Europe was whether Elizabeth was truly a virgin. Much speculation surrounded her relationship with Robert Dudley, especially about whether it was ever physically consummated. In 1559, Dudley's chambers were moved next to Elizabeth's, raising eyebrows. Then, in 1561, Elizabeth fell seriously ill, and her body swelled, leading to further rumors. In 1587, a young man named Arthur Dudley was arrested in Spain, claiming to be the illegitimate son of Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. His age matched the timeline of Elizabeth's illness in 1561, and he shared a detailed story of his life, including being born in the royal palace. However, after an investigation, Spanish officials found his claims unconvincing, and King Philip II decided to keep him in custody. Arthur Dudley was never heard from again. Today, historians consider the story unlikely, arguing that Elizabeth's life was so closely observed that hiding a pregnancy would have been nearly impossible. Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth's main policy toward Scotland was to push back against the French influence there. She feared the French might invade England and place her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Many considered Mary a strong claimant to the English crown because she was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's older sister, Margaret. Mary even claimed to be Elizabeth's closest relative. Persuaded by her advisors, Elizabeth sent a force to support the Protestant rebels in Scotland. Though the campaign had its flaws, the Treaty of Edinburgh in July 1560 successfully removed the French threat. When Mary returned to Scotland from France in 1561 to rule, the country already had a Protestant church and was governed by a council of Protestant nobles who were supported by Elizabeth. Mary refused to agree to the terms of the treaty. In 1563, Elizabeth proposed that her own favorite, Robert Dudley, marry Mary, though neither Dudley nor Mary was particularly interested. In 1565, Mary married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who also had a claim to the English throne. This decision, along with others, weakened Mary's position. Darnley quickly became unpopular and was murdered in 1567, likely by conspirators led by James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Just months later, Mary married Bothwell, raising suspicions that she had a role in Darnley's death. Elizabeth wrote to Mary, criticizing her decision, especially given the public accusations against Bothwell for murder. Mary's choices soon led to her downfall. She was defeated, imprisoned in Lochleven Castle, and forced to give up her throne to her one-year-old son, James VI, who was taken to Stirling Castle to be raised as a Protestant. Mary escaped in 1568, but after a defeat at Langside, fled to England, expecting Elizabeth's help. While Elizabeth initially considered restoring Mary to power, she and her council decided it was too risky. Instead, they kept Mary in England, where she remained imprisoned for the next 19 years. Catholic cause. Mary soon became a key figure in rebellion efforts. In 1569, a significant Catholic uprising took place in the north of England. The rebels aimed to rescue Mary, marry her to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and place her on the English throne. After their defeat, Elizabeth ordered the execution of over 750 rebels. Believing the revolt might succeed, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull in 1570 called Regnans in Excelsis. This bull excommunicated Elizabeth, calling her the pretended Queen of England and the servant of crime, and declared that her subjects were no longer obligated to obey her. Catholics who followed Elizabeth's orders were threatened with excommunication. This papal decree led to harsher laws against Catholics by Parliament, though Elizabeth managed to temper some of these measures. By 1581, it became a treasonable offense, punishable by death, for English subjects to convert to Catholicism with the intent to withdraw allegiance from Elizabeth. During the 1570s, missionary priests secretly entered England to promote Catholicism, and some were executed, becoming martyrs in the eyes of the Catholic community. The bull Regnans in Excelsis gave English Catholics strong reasons to view Mary as the rightful queen. While Mary may not have known about every plot to place her on the English throne, from the Ridolfi plot of 1571, which led to the execution of her suitor, the Duke of Norfolk, to the Babington Plot of 1586, Elizabeth's spymaster. Francis Walsingham and the Royal Council carefully built a case against her. Initially, Elizabeth was reluctant to execute Mary. However, by late 1586, she was convinced to approve Mary's trial and execution based on letters found during the Babington Plot. Elizabeth declared that Mary had plotted against her life and the crown. On February 8, 1587, Mary was executed by beheading at Fotheringhay Castle. After the execution, Elizabeth claimed she did not intend for the death warrant to be carried out and blamed her secretary, William Davison, for proceeding without her consent. Both contemporaries and later historians have questioned the sincerity of Elizabeth's remorse and whether she genuinely wanted to delay the execution. Wars and overseas trade. Elizabeth's foreign policy was predominantly defensive, with a notable exception being the English occupation of Le Havre from October 1562 to June 1563. This attempt ended in failure when Elizabeth's Huguenot allies joined forces with the Catholics to reclaim the port. Elizabeth had hoped to exchange Le Havre for Calais, which had been lost to France in January 1558. Beyond this, Elizabeth's assertiveness was primarily shown through her naval engagements. Her fleets played a crucial role in the conflict with Spain, which was largely conducted at sea. Elizabeth knighted Francis Drake after his circumnavigation of the globe from 1577 to 1580. And he earned acclaim for his raids on Spanish ports and fleets. However, Elizabeth had limited control over the piracy and self-enrichment motives driving many of her seafarers. Netherlands. Following the loss of Le Havre, Elizabeth avoided military actions on the continent until 1585. When she sent an English army to support the Protestant Dutch rebels against Philip II. This decision was influenced by the deaths of Elizabeth's allies William the Silent and the Duke of Anjou, and the surrender of several Dutch towns to Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, Philip's governor of the Spanish Netherlands. The alliance between Philip II and the French Catholic League further complicated the situation, increasing Spanish influence along the French coast and heightening the threat of invasion to England. The Siege of Antwerp in 1585 prompted the Treaty of Nonsuch, where Elizabeth pledged military aid to the Dutch, marking the start of the Anglo-Spanish War, which continued until the Treaty of London in 1604. The campaign was led by Elizabeth's former suitor, the Earl of Leicester. From the beginning, Elizabeth's support was tepid. She secretly began peace talks with Spain shortly after Leicester's arrival, contradicting his efforts to lead a vigorous military campaign. Leicester's acceptance of the post of Governor-General from the Dutch States General was seen by Elizabeth as an attempt to force her into sovereignty over the Netherlands, which she had always rejected. Her dissatisfaction was publicly expressed, and her continued negotiations with Spain further weakened Leicester's position. His failure to secure the Dutch campaign, combined with a lack of funds and support, led to his resignation in December 1587. Spanish Armada. In 1585 and 1586, Francis Drake's major voyages against Spanish ports and ships included a successful raid on Cadiz, where he destroyed the Spanish fleet intended for an invasion of England. On July 12, 1588, the Spanish Armada set sail with plans to transport a Spanish invasion force under the Duke of Parma to England. The Armada was defeated by a combination of misfortune and the English fire ships that attacked off Gravelines on 28 to 29 July, scattering the Spanish fleet. The remnants of the Armada returned to Spain after suffering further losses along the Irish coast. Elizabeth's address to her troops at Tilbury on August 8, in which she famously declared her heart and stomach were those of a king, was a symbol of national unity and resistance. The defeat of the Armada was celebrated as a significant victory and a sign of divine favor for England, though the war with Spain continued with fluctuating fortunes. France. In 1589, following the Protestant Henry IV's accession to the French throne, Elizabeth provided military support to counter the Catholic League and Philip II's influence. However, the English campaigns in France were plagued by disorganization and ineffectiveness. Elizabeth's commanders often ignored her directives and struggled with inadequate resources. Notable failures included the campaigns led by Peregrine Bertie and John Norreys. And Elizabeth's lack of control over her commanders, such as Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, contributed to the lack of success. Elizabeth's reluctance to fully commit to the French cause led to ineffective military operations and eventual withdrawal. Ireland. In Ireland, Elizabeth faced resistance from a largely autonomous and Catholic population. Her policy included granting land to courtiers and preventing rebels from aiding Spain. During uprisings, Crown forces employed scorched earth tactics, resulting in significant suffering. The 9 Years' War, a major conflict with the Irish leader Hugh O'Neill, was a severe test for Elizabeth. Robert Devereux's ineffective campaign led to his replacement by Charles Blount, who eventually secured O'Neill's surrender in 1603, shortly after Elizabeth's death. A peace treaty with Spain was signed soon thereafter. Russia. Elizabeth maintained diplomatic relations with the Tsardom of Russia, initially established by her half-brother Edward VI. She corresponded with Tsar Ivan the Terrible and even considered a marriage proposal from him. After Ivan's death, his son Fifer I showed less interest in exclusive trade with England, leading to failed negotiations and Elizabeth's continued but unsuccessful efforts to maintain favorable relations. Muslim states. Trade and diplomatic relations with the Barbary states and the Ottoman Empire developed during Elizabeth's reign. England established trading relationships with Morocco and engaged in negotiations for an alliance against Spain. Diplomatic exchanges with the Ottoman Empire included discussions on mutual interests and trade agreements. Despite some proposals for joint military actions against Spain, no significant alliance materialized before both Elizabeth and the Ottoman Sultan Murad III passed away. America. In 1583, Humphrey Gilbert attempted to establish a colony in Newfoundland but did not return. Gilbert's half-brother, Walter Raleigh, claimed the territory of Virginia and established the Roanoke colony in 1585. Although the initial settlement failed, it marked the beginning of English attempts to establish a foothold in North America. East India Company. The East India Company was chartered by Elizabeth on December 31, 1600 to trade in the Indian Ocean and China. For 15 years, it held a monopoly on English trade in the region. The company eventually became a major player in global trade and established substantial territories in India in the 18th and 19th centuries. Later years. The period following the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 brought fresh challenges for Elizabeth I that persisted until the end of her reign. Prolonged conflicts with Spain and unrest in Ireland continued, while heavy taxation, poor harvests, and the financial strain of war worsened economic conditions. As prices increased and living standards declined, Elizabeth's government intensified its repression of Catholics. In 1591, she authorized commissions to interrogate and monitor Catholic households. To maintain a facade of peace and prosperity, Elizabeth increasingly relied on internal spies and propaganda. By her final years, growing criticism reflected a decline in public affection for her. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, was a favorite of Elizabeth despite his unpredictable and irresponsible behavior. During this later phase of Elizabeth's reign, often referred to as her second reign, the Privy Council underwent a significant change. The key figures from earlier in her rule, such as the Earl of Leicester, Francis Walsingham, and Christopher Hatton, had all died by the early 1590s. This shift led to increased factional strife within the government. A bitter rivalry developed between Devereux and Robert Cecil, Lord Burleigh's son, leading to intense competition for power that marred the kingdom's politics. Elizabeth's personal authority waned, as illustrated by the 1594 affair involving Drive Rodrigo Lopez, her trusted physician. When Lopez was wrongfully accused of treason by Devereux out of personal vendetta, Elizabeth was unable to prevent his execution, despite her skepticism about his guilt. In her later years, Elizabeth turned to granting monopolies as a way to distribute patronage without seeking additional funds from Parliament during wartime. This practice led to price fixing, the enrichment of courtiers at the public's expense, and widespread discontent. By 1601, this unrest culminated in agitation in the House of Commons. In her famous Golden Speech delivered on November 30, 1601, At Whitehall Palace, Elizabeth claimed ignorance of the abuses and sought to placate the members with promises and emotional appeals. Despite the economic and political turmoil of this period, England experienced a remarkable literary flourishing. The late 1570s saw the emergence of new literary trends with John Lyly's Euphues and Edmund Spenser's The Shepherd's Calendar. The 1590s brought the maturation of significant literary figures such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. The English theatre reached its zenith, and the era's greatness is largely attributed to the builders. Dramatists, poets, and musicians active during Elizabeth's reign, though the Queen herself was not a major patron of the arts. As Elizabeth grew older, her public image shifted. She was depicted as figures such as Belphoebe or Astrea and, following the Armada, as Gloriana, the eternally youthful fairy queen from Spenser's poem. Elizabeth's painted portraits became increasingly idealized, presenting her as younger than she was. The reality of her physical decline, caused by smallpox scars, severe tooth decay, and reliance on wigs and cosmetics, was obscured. Despite her deteriorating health, courtiers continued to praise her beauty. Elizabeth, who may have believed in her own idealized image, became particularly indulgent towards the charming but unreliable Earl of Essex. Her favoritism towards him, despite his growing irresponsibility, culminated in his rebellion in 1601 and subsequent execution. Elizabeth's senior advisor, Lord Burleigh, passed away on August 4, 1598, leaving his son Robert Cecil to lead the government. Cecil, tasked with preparing for a smooth succession, negotiated secretly with James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth responded favorably to James's approach, although she never explicitly named her successor. Elizabeth's health declined sharply in late 1602, exacerbated by the deaths of close friends. Her last months were marked by severe depression, and she passed away on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace. Following her death, Cecil and the council swiftly proclaimed James as King of England. Elizabeth's funeral, held on April 28, 1603, was marked by public mourning. Her coffin was carried downriver at night to Whitehall and then to Westminster Abbey, where she was interred alongside her half-sister, Mary I. The tomb's Latin inscription reads, Regno consorts and Anna, hic abdormimus Elizabethae et Maria sorors, in spe resurrectionis, which translates to Consorts in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of resurrection. Thanks for watching. For more intriguing stories and history, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss our next video. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.